Lecture 32. This is Globalization and World History. Let's characterize globalization for a moment. Certainly it's a framework for modern life. It represents a fundamental change in human history. Most of human history, people lived quite isolated and saw very little of the world. Today, of course, we do not live isolated lives, do we? We're constantly in touch with the rest of the world through social media, through our laptop computers, and television, and so on. Certainly the Earth is much smaller than it used to be. This makes the same point, doesn't it? It took Marco Polo a few years to reach China from Venice. Today, of course, you can get a ticket and reach Beijing tomorrow. Rapid technological changes in communications and transportation, satellites, planes, the internet, all these things tend to shrink the world, make it a much smaller and much more accessible place. Contact with a wide variety of people is now possible. Certainly in an urban setting, you are going to encounter people from all over the world as people gather at universities to go to school, or at hospitals to work, or in the arts, and so on. Is this a good or a bad thing? Well, it seems to be the sort of inexorable drive of world history, this process of globalization. You can see that many people believe that it is a bad thing. Just look at the recent election in the United States with the victory of Donald Trump. Trump appears to be rejecting globalization, as do many of his followers, in an attempt to sort of, what's their slogan, make America great again? It's one thing to try to manage a leadership position in this globalization, as the United States has traditionally done. It's something quite new to reject it and to begin to pull back away from it, or an attempt to. I don't know that it's possible to escape globalization anymore. World opinion is now brought to bear on local practices because everything's now visible and accessible to a large audience. Can we measure the changes brought about by globalization? Should globalization be a cause for optimism? After all, as people become more familiar with each other and begin to share more and more values with each other, will this reduce the chances for war? Now, how do we fit globalization into world history? The key theme is the ongoing tension between local and traditional societies on the one hand, with the more modern industrial societies on the other. Another key theme, people are not able to move from place to place, and country to country, and continent to continent, the way they do today. And like we mentioned earlier, traditionally, people grew up, lived, and died within a few miles of their birthplace. That is no longer even remotely true. We have access to the entire world today. Another key theme is the spread of disease. Will humans develop increasing immunities as everyone is exposed to pathogens that once lived on the other side of the world? Remember, the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere are destroyed by European diseases for which they had no immunity. As the human population becomes increasingly intermixed, will these immunities increase and therefore large-scale pandemics decrease? Environmental concerns obviously have become a global issue. Acid rain from pollution, nuclear disasters. You remember the catastrophe at Chernobyl in Ukraine back in the mid-1980s. Global warming continues to be a topic of constant controversy, and it's become quite politicized, as you well know. Pesticides, their impact, the runoff of pesticides from large-scale agriculture. And then, of course, we have what's today called perhaps the sixth extinction event, the Anthropocene extinction event, sort of a man-made catastrophe whereby we're moving plants and animals rapidly from one environment to another, and this often causes local extinctions on large scales. When did globalization start? Good question. Some people could point to the ancient Silk Roads that linked Rome and China in antiquity. Others can point to the Crusades, where Christianity and Islam began to mingle. They began to exchange things, ideas and products and spices and silks and so on and so forth. Did globalization begin with the European Age of Discovery? Did it start with Columbus? You could make that argument, certainly. We talked about the Columbian Exchange, whereby you have domesticated plants and animals being swapped, technologies, faith, just a wide variety that tends to link the world together. Now, certainly in the 19th century, we have just an array of new technologies that tend to globalize the planet. Here I'm thinking of steamships, telegraph, railroads, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. You have increasingly international trade. You have travel with international sports. You have a worldwide postal service. You can mail a letter to Australia if you want. You have organizations that advocate for women, or in the past for slaves, mistreatment of POWs. There are endless causes, and these organizations tend to escape the boundaries of a particular state, and they either become regional or worldwide. A retreat from globalization. We've seen instances of this. In the 20th century, these nations attempted to back out of globalization. Again, the Soviet Union, with its centrally planned economy. Red China, certainly under Mao in the 50s and 60s, with the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to modernize China, with disastrous results, certainly for the people. You see the Nazis under Hitler, an attempt, I guess you could make the argument that the Nazis were either attempting to create their own economic empire or perhaps to dominate the world's economy. Is the withdrawal of these nations a reaction to globalization, or is it an attempt to strengthen themselves in order to dominate the global system? This is a big question. And again, the recent election of Donald Trump appears to be a reaction against globalization. How do societies respond to globalization? Well, India, for instance, tends to be very tolerant of outside influences without losing its national identity. This is probably because, in part, long-term British rule there. India is a very cosmopolitan place. Japan, traditionally rather isolated and wary of outsiders, has become more and more involved in the world. South Korea and China are large players on the global scene. North Korea, of course, is not and remains isolated and dangerous. Sub-Saharan Africa is certainly a part of globalization, though the impact seems to be that of enhancing Africa's role as a peripheral region of the world's economy. Now, the Arab people see globalization through an Islamic lens, and we don't know the final story here. Again, is ISIS an agent for modernization, or is ISIS seeking to take the Arabic people backward into time? Europeans have traditionally embraced globalization, but now more and more European nations appear very wary of Muslim immigration to their nations because of the rise of terrorism. The U.S. is obviously a major player on the global scene, yet the recent election of Trump demonstrates distrust, perhaps, of much of the rest of the world. In addition, the U.S. is always very jealous of its sovereignty and suspicious of outside organizations that wield power. And here I'm thinking about the United Nations, the climate agreements, trade pacts. The United States is always very suspicious of any organization or treaties that would tend to limit our freedom of action or our sovereignty. So world history at least allows us to see how various nations and regions of the world react to this increasing phenomenon of globalization. Thank you.